My name is Everett Kovacs. I was a prison electrician at Rayford Maximum Security when the dead started walking. For 96 hours, I survived hell on earth as inmates and guards turned into monsters around me. Everything I knew about that prison, every maintenance tunnel, every circuit breaker, became my lifeline. This is how I escaped when everyone else died. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I still remember when everything was normal, before the world went to hell, before I had to rewire doors to keep the dead out and the living in. My name is Everett Kovacs, and until 4 days ago, I was just a senior maintenance electrician at Rayford Maximum Security Federal Penitentiary outside Detroit. Now I might be one of the last people alive who made it out of there. Rayford was built in the 90s, 6 concrete blocks radiating from a central hub like wheel spokes, housing over 2,000 inmates with about 300 staff working on rotating shifts. From maximum security to minimum, all types of offenders in one massive compound. I knew every inch of those electrical systems, every circuit breaker, every backup generator, every security camera feed. The warden used to joke that I knew the prison better than he did. He was right. That knowledge kept me alive when everything fell apart. The prison was a fortress. 18-foot concrete walls topped with razor wire, guard towers at each corner with searchlights and snipers, 3 separate security checkpoints just to get into the main building, remote-controlled doors that could only be opened from the central security office. The place was designed to keep dangerous people in, not out. Funny how that worked in my favor when the time came. It started about 2 weeks before Black Friday. Reports of a strange flu spreading through the Midwest. Nothing too alarming at first, just another seasonal bug. But this one moved fast. People in my maintenance department started calling in sick. First Johnson, then Diaz, then half the electrical team was out. Administration was pushing us to work doubles, triples sometimes. No one to replace us. I should have seen the signs. The warden having closed-door meetings with medical staff. Guards showing up with face masks before it was protocol. An entire wing of the medical unit being cleared out and prepped for isolation cases. One of the nurses, Sandra, told me they were briefed on new quarantine procedures, but she wouldn't say more. Just looked scared. I remember that last normal morning perfectly. Black Friday. I'd been at the prison since 4 in the morning because the backup generator in Block C had been acting up, and with so many staff out sick, I was the only one who could fix it. The prison felt different that day. Tense. The inmates were unusually quiet during morning count, which is never a good sign. When prisoners get quiet, they're either planning something or they're scared. Looking back, I think they sensed something was coming before the rest of us did. I was heading to the staff break room when I overheard 2 guards, Martinez and Thompson, talking in hushed voices. Thompson had just come from escorting an inmate to medical. "I'm telling you, man, it was like nothing I've seen," Thompson was saying. "This guy was fine yesterday. Now he's burning up with fever, bleeding from his eyes." Dr. Patel took one look and hit the isolation button. "Full hazmat protocols." Martinez shook his head. "They're saying Detroit General is overwhelmed. My cousin works ER there. Says they're treating patients in the parking lot, and half the medical staff is down with the same symptoms." That should have been my cue to get out while I still could. But where would I go? My apartment in the city? Airports were probably worse. And I had responsibilities. Systems that needed maintaining. So I grabbed my coffee and headed back down to the basement where the main electrical room was located. Around 11 that morning, the first real warning came. A facility-wide email from the warden. Due to public health concerns, all visitation is suspended indefinitely. Staff are required to wear provided PPE at all times when interacting with the inmate population. Medical evaluation checkpoints will be established at all staff entrances effective immediately. I was checking the circuits for Block D when one of the newer guards, kid named Ramirez, came by. His face was pale. "Hey, Kovac, you hear about Mendez?" He got bit breaking up a fight in the cafeteria. Inmate just lunged and took a chunk out of his arm. They sent him home, but he looked really bad. Fever started almost immediately. That was unusual. Bite infections don't typically trigger fevers that fast. But I didn't think much of it then. Just another day at Rayford, where violence was the background noise to our daily lives. I spent the next few hours in the maintenance tunnels beneath Block D, replacing some faulty wiring. The tunnels run under the entire prison complex, narrow concrete passageways with pipes and electrical conduits. Most staff hated them. Too cramped, too dark, easy to get lost if you didn't know the layout. But I preferred working down there. Quiet. No inmates, rarely any other staff. Just me and the hum of electricity. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when I made my way back to the main electrical room in the basement level beneath central processing. I was logging my work when I felt the building shudder slightly. Then the alarms started blaring. Not the usual containment breach pattern. This was a medical emergency alert from multiple locations simultaneously. Block D first, then Block A seconds later. I tried calling the security office on my radio but got nothing but static and fragments of panicked voices. Through my small window in the electrical room door, I saw Officer Mendez run past, the same Mendez who had supposedly been sent home after being bitten. His uniform was covered in blood, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. But what struck me most were his eyes, vacant, unseeing. He wasn't the Mendez I knew anymore. The lights flickered, then stabilized. On my monitor, I could see that emergency protocols were being initiated across the facility. Automated lockdown sequences engaging, section by section. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the prison was sealing itself off. I should have left then, tried to make it to an exit. But years of working in a prison environment teaches you caution above all else. So I stayed put, locked the electrical room door, and tried to make sense of what was happening through the facility management systems. The prison radio channels told the story in fragments. Medical emergencies in multiple blocks, violent inmates attacking staff and other prisoners, security teams responding with riot gear. Then, more disturbing reports, inmates with impossible injuries still attacking, guards emptying entire magazines into attacking prisoners with no effect, someone shouting about headshots being the only thing that worked. I thought it was mass hysteria until I patched into the security camera feeds. What I saw didn't make sense. Inmates and guards alike moved. I spent the next few hours in the maintenance tunnels beneath Block D, replacing some faulty wiring. The tunnels run under the entire prison complex, narrow concrete passageways with pipes and electrical conduits. Most staff hated them. Too cramped, too dark, easy to get lost if you didn't know the layout. But I preferred working down there. Quiet. No inmates, rarely any other staff. Just me and the hum of electricity. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when I made my way back to the main electrical room in the basement level beneath central processing. I was logging my work when I felt the building shudder slightly. Then the alarms started blaring. Not the usual containment breach pattern. This was a medical emergency alert from multiple locations simultaneously. Block D first, then Block A seconds later. I tried calling the security office on my radio but got nothing but static and fragments of panicked voices. Through my small window in the electrical room door, I saw Officer Mendez run past, The same Mendez who had supposedly been sent home after being bitten. His uniform was covered in blood, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. But what struck me most were his eyes. Vacant, unseeing. He wasn't the Mendez I knew anymore. The lights flickered, then stabilized. On my monitor, I could see that emergency protocols were being initiated across the facility. Automated lockdown sequences engaging, section by section. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the prison was sealing itself off. I should have left then, tried to make it to an exit. But years of working in a prison environment teaches you caution above all else. So I stayed put, locked the electrical room door, and tried to make sense of what was happening through the facility management systems. The prison radio channels told the story in fragments. Medical emergencies in multiple blocks, violent inmates attacking staff and other prisoners, security teams responding with riot gear. Then, more disturbing reports, inmates with impossible injuries still attacking, guards emptying entire magazines into attacking prisoners with no effect. Someone shouting about headshots being the only thing that worked. I thought it was mass hysteria until I patched into the security camera feeds. What I saw didn't make sense. Inmates and guards alike moving with strange shambling gaits attacking anyone they could grab. Blood everywhere. And the attacked quickly became attackers themselves. In the command center feed, I watched as the warden barricaded himself in his office with 3 guards. They were arguing about evacuation protocols when one of the guards, the prison radio was chaos. I adjusted frequencies, trying to piece together what was happening. Security teams were being dispatched to multiple locations. Medical staff calling for backup. Then, terrified reports of staff being attacked by inmates who shouldn't have been able to move with their injuries. Guards reporting that standard compliance techniques were ineffective. Then, someone shouted something that made my blood run cold. "They're not stopping when we shoot them. Aim for the head." I'd worked at Rayford for 12 years. Been through riots, hostage situations, attempted breakouts. Nothing prepared me for what was unfolding. This wasn't just an incident. It was a collapse. The overhead lights flickered again, then stabilized. Our main power was still functioning, but system diagnostics showed unusual power draws throughout the facility. Doors repeatedly trying to cycle open and closed as motion sensors detected activity. Security cameras being accessed from multiple terminals simultaneously as people tried to understand what was happening. On one of the security feeds, I saw a group of guards in riot gear moving through the corridor outside the cafeteria. They moved with disciplined precision until something rushed them from an intersecting hallway. The feed was grainy, but I could make out what looked like kitchen staff, their white uniforms now dark with stains. The guards formed a defensive line, batons raised. The first guard went down under the weight of 3 attackers. The others backed away, then raised their weapons. I switched off that feed too. Through my window, I could see the hallway outside the electrical room. It was one of the main throughways connecting the central processing hub to Block C. Under normal circumstances, it would be busy with staff and escorted inmates. Now it was empty except for the occasional figure hurrying past, too fast to get a good look at their condition. Then came the lockdown. The heavy steel fire doors at either end of the corridor slammed shut, their magnetic locks engaging with a definitive thunk. I was sealed in this section of the basement with whatever else had been caught here when the doors closed. For nearly an hour, there was eerie silence. The radio channels had gone quiet except for occasional static bursts. Power was holding steady. Through my window, nothing moved in the corridor. I almost convinced myself that the worst had passed, that containment protocols had worked. Then I heard it. A wet, shuffling sound from the corridor. A maintenance worker appeared, pushing a mop bucket. Alvarez from the night crew. I nearly called out to him, desperate for information, for human contact. Something stopped me. The way he moved. Jerky, without purpose. The mop bucket was leaving a dark trail behind it. As he passed my window, he turned. His face was gray, eyes clouded. A chunk of his neck was simply missing, the wound not even bleeding anymore. Something fundamental had changed in him. This wasn't Alvarez anymore. Just his body, moving without him. I backed away from the window. My boot hit an empty toolbox, sending it clattering across the floor. The sound wasn't loud, but in the silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. Outside, the thing that had been Alvarez stopped, turned toward my door, pressed against it. The door was heavy steel, locked from the inside. But seeing those vacant eyes peering through the window, hearing the low moan as fingers scrabbled against metal, I knew with certainty. If it got in, I was dead. For 20 minutes, it remained there, occasionally banging against the door with surprising force. Eventually, some other sound must have drawn its attention. It shuffled away, disappearing down the corridor. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, afraid that any movement, any sound would bring it back. When I finally moved, it was with painful slowness. I needed to understand the full situation. The electrical room had multiple monitors showing power distribution throughout the facility. By checking which systems were still drawing power, I could get a rough map of where activity was concentrated. The pattern was chaotic but telling. Cell blocks showed massive power fluctuations as emergency systems tried to override standard protocols. Medical was drawing maximum power, all systems activated. Most disturbing was central security, minimal power usage, which meant the command center had either been abandoned or was no longer functioning. I pulled up a schematic of the maintenance tunnels. If I could reach the security office through the tunnels, I might get a better picture of the facility's status. It was risky, but sitting in the electrical room waiting to die wasn't an option. My preparations were methodical. I changed from my standard uniform into the heavier maintenance coveralls kept in the storage locker. More protection, more pockets. I filled those pockets with tools that could double as weapons. Heavy screwdrivers, a utility knife, electrical tape. Clipped my flashlight to my belt. Took a final inventory of the electrical room to ensure I wasn't forgetting anything essential. The prison-issued radio wasn't working for communication, but I took it anyway for the emergency light function. The maintenance tunnel access was through a hatch in the floor of the electrical room. I hadn't used it in months. Most days there was no reason to crawl through the tunnels when you could walk the corridors. I pulled up the heavy metal cover, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The beam of my flashlight showed a concrete tunnel barely 5 feet high, forcing me to hunch as I moved. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and hot wiring. These tunnels were the prison's circulatory system, carrying power, water, and ventilation throughout the massive complex. They weren't on any publicly available blueprints. Even most guards didn't know their full layout. I moved as quietly as possible, aware that sound carried strangely in these concrete arteries. The tunnel branched repeatedly, but I knew the way. 300 yards to the junction beneath central processing. Then up the service ladder to the small maintenance closet adjacent to the security office. If the security office was still operational, I could get a facility-wide view of the situation through their monitors. At the junction, I paused to listen. The concrete walls muffled most sounds, but I could hear a persistent banging from somewhere above, and something else. A low, constant moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The ladder to central processing was at the end of the eastern tunnel. As I approached, I saw something that made me stop cold. Dark liquid dripping from the ceiling, pooling on the concrete floor beneath the closed hatch. Fresh blood. I had a choice: retreat to the electrical room or continue upward into unknown danger. But the electrical room was a dead end. No food, no water beyond what I had. No exit strategy. Forward was the only real option. I approached the ladder carefully, avoiding the blood pool, placed my ear against the hatch above. Nothing. I pushed gently. It moved slightly, then stopped. Something was blocking it from above. I applied more pressure, slowly, trying to minimize noise. The hatch lifted enough for me to peer through the gap. The maintenance closet above was dark, but my flashlight revealed the obstacle. A body slumped against the hatch. Security uniform, not moving. No visible bites or wounds, but a small handgun clutched in rigid fingers, and a dark splash on the wall behind told the story clearly enough. I pushed the hatch fully open, the body shifting with it. Climbed into the closet and confirmed what I already knew. The guard had chosen a quick exit when things went bad. I respectfully took his weapon and checked the magazine. 2 rounds remaining. Not much, but in this new world, 2 chances at survival were better than none. The closet door had a small window inset at eye level. Through it I could see part of the security office. Monitors still glowing, chairs overturned. No movement. I eased the door open a crack, listening. The moaning was louder here, but seemed to be coming from further away, perhaps the main corridor beyond the security office. I slipped into the security room, closing the closet door behind me. The scene was one of hasty abandonment. Half-empty coffee cups, a jacket thrown over a chair. A security monitor cracked, as if someone had struck it in anger or fear. But the systems were still operational. I moved to the main console, careful not to disturb anything that might make noise. The monitor bank told the grim story. Camera feeds from throughout the facility showed the same scene repeated with minor variations. Bodies on the ground. The infected wandering aimlessly or clustered around fresh victims. Some areas appeared empty, but those were few. I checked the external cameras. The prison yard was filled with the infected, guards and inmates indistinguishable now in their shared condition. The main gates remained closed, the perimeter unbreached. Whatever had happened had started inside these walls. I accessed the security logs, hoping to understand how this had begun. The most recent entries painted a picture of escalating chaos. Patient 0 appeared to be an inmate returning from a hospital visit 3 days earlier. By the time symptoms appeared, it was too late. The infection had already spread to the medical staff treating him, then to the guards who responded when those staff turned violent. From there, containment was impossible. The final log entry was from Warden Phillips himself. Evacuation protocols have failed. Military support withdrawn. God help anyone still alive in here. That's when I heard it. A shuffling sound from the corridor outside the security office, then another. The moaning was getting louder. Multiple infected moving this way. I couldn't stay here. The infected were closing in on the security office. Through the window in the door, I could see shadows moving in the hallway. I had seconds, not minutes, to find an exit strategy. The security office had 2 doors, the main entrance from the hallway where the infected were approaching, and a second door leading to the warden's office. That door was locked, accessible only with senior staff credentials. Fortunately, the security console had an emergency override function. I activated it, hearing the satisfying click as the warden's office door unlocked. As the main door began to rattle with the impact of multiple bodies pressing against it, I slipped into the warden's office and closed the door behind me. The warden's office was untouched, almost peaceful, no signs of struggle or violence. Phillips must have left before things got bad in this section. His office had another advantage, a small private bathroom with a solid door and no windows. If I needed to hide, it would serve. More importantly, the warden's office had a window overlooking the prison yard. The view confirmed what the security monitors had shown. Dozens of infected personnel shambling aimlessly in the open area. Guard towers empty. No signs of rescue or military presence. We had been abandoned. I needed a long-term plan. The prison was designed to house inmates for years with sufficient supplies. The commissary and kitchen storage contained enough food to feed thousands. If I could secure one of those areas, I might survive until help arrived, if help was coming at all. Night had fallen while I'd been moving through the facility. The prison was eerily transformed in the darkness, emergency lights casting long shadows down empty corridors. The infected seemed more active at night, as if the darkness somehow energized them. Their moans echoed through the facility, rising and falling like some terrible tide. From the warden's office, I had options. There was a maintenance access panel hidden behind a bookshelf, another entry point to the tunnel system. The tunnels would take me almost anywhere in the prison, if I could navigate them safely in the dark. I decided to head for the kitchen storage area. Food, water, and a relatively isolated position with limited access points I could secure. I moved the bookshelf, opened the access panel, and descended once more into the maintenance tunnels. The journey through the tunnels was tense. Twice I had to freeze in place as strange sounds echoed through the concrete passageways. Once, something large moved through a perpendicular tunnel ahead of me. I couldn't see it clearly in the darkness, just a hulking shadow that dragged one leg as it moved. I waited until it was gone before proceeding. The kitchen storage access point was beneath the main freezer. I emerged into pitch darkness. The power to this section apparently failed. My flashlight beam showed rows of industrial shelving stocked with supplies. No movement, no sound except the sporadic hum of a refrigeration unit running on emergency power. I secured the access hatch behind me and began to explore the storage area. The main door to the kitchen was barricaded from my side with a heavy shelf. Someone had tried to create a safe space here, but hadn't returned. I found evidence of their stay: an empty water bottle, a makeshift bedroll in the corner. That first night in kitchen storage was the longest of my life. Every sound, every creak of the building settling, sent my heart racing. The moans would occasionally grow louder, then fade, as the infected moved through nearby areas. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Instead, I inventoried supplies and planned my next move. By dawn, I had a clearer picture of my situation. The storage area had enough food and water to last months, limited access points that could be secured, but no communication with the outside world, no way to know if rescue was coming, and no long-term sustainability. This was survival, not living. With morning light filtering through small high windows, I felt bold enough to try accessing the security systems again. Not from the overrun security office, but through a maintenance terminal in a small office adjacent to the storage area. These terminals had limited functionality but could access basic systems for diagnostic purposes. The news wasn't good. External cameras showed no change, no rescue vehicles, no military, just infected personnel still wandering the grounds. Internal power systems were failing section by section as backup generators ran out of fuel. Most concerning, the automated fire suppression system was detecting high temperatures in the eastern cell blocks. If a fire started, it could spread throughout the facility. I needed to see more of the prison to understand the full extent of the situation. There was an access ladder in the storage area that led to the roof. Risky to be in the open, but it would give me the best view of both the prison and the surrounding area. The ladder was old, rarely used, rungs sticky with dust and grease. It led to a small maintenance hatch that opened onto the flat roof over the administrative section. I emerged into gray morning light, the air heavy with the smell of smoke. What I saw from that rooftop will stay with me forever. Detroit was burning. Multiple fires throughout the city, black smoke rising in columns. No sirens, no emergency response. On the highways visible from my position, abandoned cars stretched for miles. And moving between them, small figures. Hundreds of them. Thousands. all with that same shambling gait I'd come to recognize. The prison itself was largely intact, though smoke rose from the eastern blocks where the fire had taken hold. The main gates remained closed, but the guard posts were empty. In the yard below, the infected continued their endless, purposeless movement. They didn't seem to notice me on the roof, didn't react to my presence. Most disturbing was what I didn't see. No helicopters, no emergency vehicles, no evidence that anyone was fighting back or maintaining order. Just smoke and distant figures and silence. I stayed on that roof for an hour, scanning the horizon for any sign of organized human activity. Just as I was about to descend, I saw it. A military helicopter flying low and fast from the direction of Fort Campbell. It didn't approach the prison, didn't circle or show any indication that rescue was its purpose. It was heading downtown, moving with clear purpose. That helicopter brought both hope and fear. Hope that some form of authority still existed, some structure remained. Fear because its mission clearly didn't include Rayford or its survivors. We weren't the priority. Back in the storage area, I tried to process what I'd seen. The scope of the disaster was far beyond what I'd imagined. This wasn't just a prison incident. It was everywhere, which meant there might not be rescue coming. Ever. That realization changed everything. I wasn't waiting out a crisis anymore. I was adapting to a new reality. And adaptation meant understanding my enemies better. I spent the second day observing the infected through the security cameras still operational on emergency power. Their behavior followed patterns. They responded primarily to sound, moving toward noises with single-minded persistence. They showed no evidence of planning or cooperation. They didn't seem to need rest or sustenance. Most important, they couldn't open doors or solve even simple problems like moving obstacles. These observations gave me the beginnings of a strategy. Move quietly. Use sound to distract and divert. Stay behind secured doors whenever possible. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As night fell again, I prepared to expand my safe zone. The kitchen adjacent to storage had multiple access points, making it difficult to secure, but it also had something I needed: a gas stove that could provide heat and cooking capability if the power failed completely. I needed to clear it, secure it, make it an extension of my safe area. I armed myself with the most effective weapon I could find: a heavy meat tenderizing mallet from the kitchen tools. The handgun was a last resort. I'd seen enough evidence that the infected only went down with head trauma, and the noise would only attract more of them. The door between storage and the main kitchen had been barricaded from my side. I removed the barricade slowly, silently, then pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. I eased it open a crack, peering through. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by emergency lighting strips along the floor. No movement visible. I opened the door wider, wincing as it creaked slightly. The industrial kitchen was massive, designed to prepare meals for thousands of inmates. Stainless steel counters, industrial mixers, massive ovens. Plenty of spaces where threats could hide. I moved through methodically, checking each potential hiding spot, securing doors as I went. I was halfway through my sweep when I found the first body, a kitchen worker sprawled on the floor by the walk-in freezer. No visible bites or injuries, no signs of turning. Just dead. The freezer door was ajar, cold air still seeping out. I approached cautiously, mallet raised. Inside the freezer, I understood. 3 more bodies, kitchen staff, and a guard, all with gunshot wounds to the head. A single handgun lay on the floor beside the guard. They had chosen a quick end when they realized there was no escape. The cold had preserved them, preventing whatever caused the turn to affect them after death. I closed the freezer door with a sense of somber respect. then continued my methodical sweep of the kitchen. It was clear. I could expand my safe zone. Over the next several hours, I secured the kitchen area, barricaded unnecessary access points, ensured doors could be locked from the inside, set up a more comfortable sleeping area near an emergency exit. For the first time since the outbreak began, I allowed myself to sleep in short bursts. 20 minutes awake, 20 asleep. Not restful, but enough to keep functioning. The third night passed without incident. By the dawn of day 3, I had established a secure position, confirmed adequate supplies, and begun to understand the rules of survival in this new reality. But I couldn't stay in the kitchen forever. Eventually, I would need to move, either to find other survivors or, ultimately, to escape. That morning, I made my first attempt to reach out to possible survivors. The kitchen had an intercom system connected to the dining hall. If anyone else was alive and moving through the facility, they might hear a broadcast. It was risky. The sound could attract infected. But I had secured my position well enough to take that risk. I activated the intercom and spoke as clearly and calmly as I could. "This is Everett Kovach Maintenance. I'm secure in the kitchen area. If anyone can hear this, I have supplies and a safe location. 3 clicks on the intercom will signal you're out there." Then I waited. For 3 hours I listened. No response. Either no one heard, no one was alive to hear, or no one trusted enough to respond. I was truly alone. The infected were closing in on the security office. Through the window in the door, I could see shadows moving in the hallway. I had seconds, not minutes, to find an exit strategy. The security office had 2 doors, the main entrance from the hallway where the infected were approaching and a second door leading to the warden's office. That door was locked, accessible only with senior staff credentials. Fortunately, the security console had an emergency override function. I activated it, hearing the satisfying click as the warden's office door unlocked. As the main door began to rattle with the impact of multiple bodies pressing against it, I slipped into the warden's office and closed the door behind me. The warden's office was untouched, almost peaceful. No signs of struggle or violence. Phillips must have left before things got bad in this section. His office had another advantage, a small private bathroom with a solid door and no windows. If I needed to hide, it would serve. More importantly, the warden's office had a window overlooking the prison yard. The view confirmed what the security monitors had shown: dozens of infected personnel shambling aimlessly in the open area. Guard towers empty, no signs of rescue or military presence. We had been abandoned. I needed a long-term plan. The prison was designed to house inmates for years with sufficient supplies. The commissary and kitchen storage contained enough food to feed thousands. If I could secure one of those areas, I might survive until help arrived. If help was coming at all. Night had fallen while I'd been moving through the facility. The prison was eerily transformed in the darkness, emergency lights casting long shadows down empty corridors. The infected seemed more active at night, as if the darkness somehow energized them. Their moans echoed through the facility, rising and falling like some terrible tide. From the warden's office, I had options. There was a maintenance access panel hidden behind a bookshelf, another entry point to the tunnel system. The tunnels would take me almost anywhere in the prison, if I could navigate them safely in the dark. I decided to head for the kitchen storage area. Food, water, and a relatively isolated position with limited access points I could secure. I moved to the bookshelf, opened the access panel, and descended once more into the maintenance tunnels. The journey through the tunnels was tense. Twice I had to freeze in place as strange sounds echoed through the concrete passageways. Once, something large moved through a perpendicular tunnel ahead of me. I couldn't see it clearly in the darkness. just a hulking shadow that dragged one leg as it moved. I waited until it was gone before proceeding. The kitchen storage access point was beneath the main freezer. I emerged into pitch darkness. The power to this section apparently failed. My flashlight beam showed rows of industrial shelving stocked with supplies. No movement, no sound except the sporadic hum of a refrigeration unit running on emergency power. I secured the access hatch behind me and began to explore the storage area. The main door to the kitchen was barricaded from my side with a heavy shelf. Someone had tried to create a safe space here, but hadn't returned. I found evidence of their stay: an empty water bottle, a makeshift bedroll in the corner. That first night in kitchen storage was the longest of my life. Every sound, every creak of the building settling sent my heart racing. The moans would occasionally grow louder, then fade as the infected moved through nearby areas. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Instead, I inventoried supplies and planned my next move. By dawn, I had a clearer picture of my situation. The storage area had enough food and water to last months, limited access points that could be secured, but no communication with the outside world. No way to know if rescue was coming, and no long-term sustainability. This was survival, not living. With morning light filtering through small, high windows, I felt bold enough to try accessing the security systems again. Not from the overrun security office, but through a maintenance terminal in a small office adjacent to the storage area. These terminals had limited functionality but could access basic systems for diagnostic purposes. The news wasn't good. External cameras showed no change, no rescue vehicles, no military, just infected personnel still wandering the grounds. Internal power systems were failing section by section as backup generators ran out of fuel. Most concerning, the automated fire suppression system was detecting high temperatures in the eastern cell blocks. If a fire started, it could spread throughout the facility. I needed to see more of the prison to understand the full extent of the situation. There was an access ladder in the storage area that led to the roof. Risky to be in the open, but it would give me the best view of both the prison and the surrounding area. The ladder was old, rarely used, rungs sticky with dust and grease. It led to a small maintenance hatch that opened onto the flat roof over the administrative section. I emerged into gray morning light, the air heavy with the smell of smoke. What I saw from that rooftop will stay with me forever. Detroit was burning. Multiple fires throughout the city, black smoke rising in columns. No sirens, no emergency response. On the highways visible from my position, abandoned cars stretched for miles, and moving between them, small figures, hundreds of them, thousands, all with that same shambling gait I'd come to recognize. The prison itself was largely intact, though smoke rose from the eastern blocks where the fire had taken hold. The main gates remained closed, but the guard posts were empty. In the yard below, the infected continued their endless, purposeless movement. They didn't seem to notice me on the roof, didn't react to my presence. Most disturbing was what I didn't see. No helicopters, no emergency vehicles, no evidence that anyone was fighting back or maintaining order. Just smoke and distant figures and silence. I stayed on that roof for an hour, scanning the horizon for any sign of organized human activity. Just as I was about to descend, I saw it. A military helicopter flying low and fast from the direction of Fort Campbell. It didn't approach the prison, didn't circle, or show any indication that rescue was its purpose. It was heading downtown, moving with clear purpose. That helicopter brought both hope and fear. Hope that some form of authority still existed, some structure remained. Fear because its mission clearly didn't include Rayford or its survivors. We weren't the priority. Back in the storage area, I tried to process what I'd seen. The scope of the disaster was far beyond what I'd imagined. This wasn't just a prison incident. It was everywhere, which meant there might not be rescue coming. Ever. That realization changed everything. I wasn't waiting out a crisis anymore. I was adapting to a new reality, and adaptation meant understanding my enemies better. I spent the second day observing the infected through the security cameras still operational on emergency power. Their behavior followed patterns. They responded primarily to sound, moving toward noises with single-minded persistence. They showed no evidence of planning or cooperation. They didn't seem to need rest or sustenance. Most important, they couldn't open doors or solve even simple problems like moving obstacles. These observations gave me the beginnings of a strategy. Move quietly. Use sound to distract and divert. Stay behind secured doors whenever possible. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As night fell again, I prepared to expand my safe zone. The kitchen adjacent to storage had multiple access points, making it difficult to secure, but it also had something I needed: a gas stove that could provide heat and cooking capability if the power failed completely. I needed to clear it, secure it, make it an extension of my safe area. I armed myself with the most effective weapon I could find: a heavy meat tenderizing mallet from the kitchen tools. The handgun was a last resort. I'd seen enough evidence that the infected only went down with head trauma, and the noise would only attract more of them. The door between storage and the main kitchen had been barricaded from my side. I removed the barricade slowly, silently, then pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. I eased it open a crack, peering through. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by emergency lighting strips along the floor. No movement visible. I opened the door wider, wincing as it creaked slightly. The industrial kitchen was massive, designed to prepare meals for thousands of inmates. Stainless steel counters, industrial mixers, massive ovens, plenty of spaces where threats could hide. I moved through methodically, checking each potential hiding spot, securing doors as I went. I was halfway through my sweep when I found the first body. A kitchen worker, sprawled on the floor by the walk-in freezer. No visible bites or injuries. No signs of turning. Just dead. The freezer door was ajar, cold air still seeping out. I approached cautiously, mallet raised. Inside the freezer, I understood. 3 more bodies, kitchen staff and a guard, all with gunshot wounds to the head. A single handgun lay on the floor beside the guard. They had chosen a quick end when they realized there was no escape. The cold had preserved them, preventing whatever caused the turn to affect them after death. I closed the freezer door with a sense of somber respect, then continued my methodical sweep of the kitchen. It was clear. I could expand my safe zone. Over the next several hours, I secured the kitchen area, barricaded unnecessary access points, ensured doors could be locked from the inside, set up a more comfortable sleeping area near an emergency exit. For the first time since the outbreak began, I allowed myself to sleep in short bursts. 20 minutes awake, 20 asleep. Not restful, but enough to keep functioning. The third night passed without incident. By the dawn of day 3, I'd established a secure position, confirmed adequate supplies, and begun to understand the rules of survival in this new reality. But I couldn't stay in the kitchen forever. Eventually, I would need to move, either to find other survivors or, ultimately, to escape. That morning, I made my first attempt to reach out to possible survivors. The kitchen had an intercom system connected to the dining hall. If anyone else was alive and moving through the facility, they might hear a broadcast. It was risky. The sound could attract infected, but I had secured my position well enough to take that risk. I activated the intercom and spoke as clearly and calmly as I could. "This is Everett Kovach's maintenance." I'm secure in the kitchen area. If anyone can hear this, I have supplies and a safe location. 3 clicks on the intercom will signal you're out there. Then I waited. For 3 hours, I listened. No response. Either no one heard, no one was alive to hear, or no one trusted enough to respond. I was truly alone. Being alone changes you. After 3 hours of silence following my intercom message, I knew I had to adapt. I wasn't just a maintenance electrician anymore. I needed to become something else, something capable of surviving in a world where the dead walked and the living were scarce. The kitchen had given me shelter and supplies, but also time to think, to plan, to evolve. That afternoon, I began my transformation from prey to predator. First came knowledge. I returned to the maintenance terminal, accessing whatever security footage remained active. I studied the infected, their movements, reactions, behaviors. Some patterns emerged that I hadn't noticed before. Not all infected moved the same way. Some were faster, more responsive to stimuli. Others barely moved at all unless something triggered them. The ones in guard uniforms, with their tactical gear and body armor, were particularly dangerous, harder to put down if it came to that. I watched one infected inmate for nearly an hour. Former linebacker named Washington. He'd been a problem even before the outbreak. Quick to violence, unpredictable. Now he moved differently than the others, more purposefully. When other infected stumbled into his path, he shoved them aside. It was almost like he retained some fragment of his personality, his aggression. That observation sent a chill through me. If some part of who they were remained after turning, what did that mean? Knowledge wasn't enough. I needed to move through the facility more efficiently, to gather resources beyond my safe zone. That meant facing the infected directly. I prepared methodically, fashioned arm and leg guards from kitchen cutting boards and duct tape, created a makeshift spear by attaching a kitchen knife to a mop handle, filled a backpack with essentials, water, energy bars from the staff break room, first aid supplies, electrical tape, batteries for my flashlight. My first excursion would be to the staff locker room, not far from the kitchen, relatively isolated, and likely to contain useful items, clothing, medications, maybe weapons from abandoned personal lockers. The route would take me through a section of hallway I hadn't cleared, potentially occupied by infected. I set out an hour before dawn, when the infected seemed least active. The hallway connecting the kitchen to the administration wing was dark, emergency lighting reduced to conserve power. I moved silently, years of prison maintenance work having taught me how to place each foot to minimize sound. The first infected appeared at the junction ahead. A former inmate in standard issue orange standing motionless, facing the wall. I froze, watching. He didn't react to my presence, no signs of awareness. I considered trying to slip past, but the hallway was narrow. Too risky. This would be my first intentional engagement. My heart hammered in my chest as I picked up an empty food can from the floor, aimed carefully, threw it far down the intersecting corridor. The can clattered against the concrete, the sound shockingly loud in the silence. The infected's reaction was immediate and predictable. Head snapping toward the sound, body following in a jerky motion, then shambling quickly in that direction. I waited until it disappeared around the corner, then moved forward. The locker room door was unlocked, slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the end of my spear, waiting for any reaction from within. Nothing. I entered, securing the door behind me. The staff locker room told its own story of the outbreak. Lockers hanging open, personal items scattered on the floor, a trail of blood leading to one of the shower stalls. I approached cautiously, spear ready. The shower contained what I expected, another turned guard. This one was sitting on the floor, head lolling, a massive bite wound visible on his neck. He reacted slowly to my presence, struggling to rise. Too slow. I stepped back, letting him come to me, then struck with the spear, clean through the eye socket. He dropped instantly. My first intentional kill. I felt nothing except a cold certainty that it had been necessary. He wasn't Officer Wilson anymore, just a threat neutralized. I worked quickly, searching lockers for anything useful. Found clothing that fit better than my maintenance coveralls, a half-empty bottle of painkillers, a personal handgun in Officer Ramirez's locker with a full magazine. Most valuable of all, a set of master keys forgotten in the rush to evacuate. On my way back to the kitchen, I encountered 2 more infected. Used the same tactic. Distraction, evasion. It worked perfectly. I was learning the rules of this new world, adapting to its requirements. Over the next 12 hours, I expanded my knowledge of safe routes throughout the facility. The maintenance tunnels remained the safest option, but limited what I could carry. Surface routes required careful planning and timing, but allowed me to transport larger items back to my safe zone. By the evening of day 3, I had transformed the kitchen into a well-supplied base of operations. Food, water, weapons, medical supplies. Multiple escape routes mapped and cleared, security improvised from kitchen equipment and maintenance tools. It should have felt like an accomplishment. Instead, I felt restless, trapped. The prison had become safer, but it was still a prison. I needed information about the outside world. The staff break room had a television, but broadcasts had stopped on day 1. There was a radio in the security office, but that area was heavily infested now. Then I remembered. The warden's office had an emergency radio, independent of the main systems. If it was still operational, it might pick up any emergency broadcasts. The route to the warden's office was complex but manageable through the maintenance tunnels. I gathered supplies for a longer excursion, food, water, additional ammunition for the handgun. Set out at midnight, when the infected in the administrative section seemed to congregate in the main lobby, away from my target. The tunnels were familiar now, navigable even in near darkness. I emerged in the warden's office without incident, securing the access panel behind me. The office was as I'd left it, untouched. The emergency radio sat on a shelf behind the desk, a seemingly ordinary device with extraordinary importance. I powered it up, thankful that it had its own battery backup, scanned through frequencies methodically, searching for any human communication. Static, dead air, more static. I was about to give up when I caught it, a repeating message, weak but discernible. This is Emergency Broadcast System Alpha. Military containment operations in progress. Civilian evacuation points established at the following locations: Ford Field, Henry Ford Hospital North Campus, Belle Isle Bridge Checkpoint. All civilians must undergo screening. Any signs of infection will result in quarantine. This message repeats every hour. The message gave me coordinates, procedures, hope, but it also mentioned something troubling: screening procedures. What exactly were they screening for? And what did quarantine really mean in a situation like this? I continued scanning frequencies, picking up fragments of military communications. Most concerning was a repeated reference to Protocol Wildfire, apparently an authorization to use lethal force against potentially infected civilians who resisted screening. The military wasn't just conducting rescue operations, they were containing the outbreak through any means necessary, including eliminating threats. And in their eyes, anyone from an infected facility like Rayford might be considered a threat. This changed my calculations. Escaping the prison wasn't enough. I would need to approach evacuation points carefully, perhaps avoid official channels entirely. But first, I needed to reach the outside world. I spent an hour studying the warden's detailed facility maps, looking for vulnerabilities in the prison's perimeter. The main gates were designed to keep people in, not out, but they were also heavily exposed. Anyone approaching them would be visible from all sides. The walls were 18 feet high, topped with razor wire. Possible to scale with the right equipment, but extremely dangerous. Then I found it. The northwest corner of the facility had a maintenance shed built against the exterior wall. It was used for storing landscaping equipment. On the blueprints, I could see that the shed's roof came within 8 feet of the top of the wall. With the right tools and timing, I could use it to escape. The route to the northwest corner would be challenging. Parts of it passed through heavily infested areas. I would need to move carefully, quietly, and eliminate any threats that couldn't be avoided. As I prepared to return to my base in the kitchen, I heard something that froze me in place. Voices, human voices, coming from somewhere in the administrative section. Not the mindless moans of the infected, but actual conversation. Survivors. I moved to the warden's door, listening intently. The voices were faint but growing louder. At least 2 people moving through the corridors. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence of human speech. My isolation had been so complete that the thought of other survivors was almost shocking. I placed my hand on the door handle, ready to call out, to reveal my presence. Something stopped me. Caution. Suspicion. 3 days of survival had taught me to question everything, to assume danger until proven otherwise. Instead of opening the door, I moved to the window overlooking the hallway, peered carefully around the edge of the blinds. 3 men moved into view. Not prison staff. Inmates. I recognized one, Jackson, serving 20 years for armed robbery. Another was Sanders, in for manslaughter. The third, I didn't know. They were armed with makeshift weapons, a fire axe, a metal pipe, what looked like a sharpened bed frame component. They weren't just surviving. They were hunting, moving systematically through offices, gathering supplies. Dangerous men before the outbreak, now free and adapting to the new world in their own way. I withdrew from the window, processing this new complication. Other survivors meant potential allies, but also potential threats. These men in particular were not people I would choose to align with. They had nothing to lose and a history of violence. In the chaos of the outbreak, they had found opportunity. Their presence changed my immediate plans. I couldn't return to the kitchen via my planned route. They were moving in that direction. I needed an alternative, and I needed to ensure they didn't discover my safe zone. I gathered what I could from the warden's office: the emergency radio, maps, a letter opener that could serve as a last resort weapon. Then slipped back into the maintenance tunnels through the access panel. As I secured it behind me, I heard the office door open. They had arrived seconds after my departure. Moving through the tunnels, I took a longer route back to the kitchen. My mind raced with implications. If these inmates had survived, others might have as well. The prison wasn't a dead zone after all. It was a contested space, with competing survivors establishing territory. I reached the kitchen without incident, securing all access points behind me. My safe zone remained undiscovered. But for how long? The inmates had been moving purposefully, searching. Eventually, they might find their way here. I needed to accelerate my plans, gather what I needed for escape, and make my move before encountering these other survivors became inevitable. The prison was no longer just about avoiding the infected. Now, it was about avoiding the living as well. That night, I slept with my back against the wall, the handgun within reach. My dreams were filled with pursuing figures, some dead, some alive, all threatening. When I woke at dawn, my resolve was hardened. This would be my final day at Rayford. One way or another, I was getting out. Day 4 began with a total power failure. I woke to darkness and silence, the steady hum of refrigeration units and emergency systems suddenly absent. Even the emergency lighting had failed. The kitchen was pitch black except for thin strips of dawn light coming through the high windows. This was what I had feared since the beginning. The prison's backup generators had finally run out of fuel. With main power already down, the entire facility was now dark. Security systems, camera feeds, electronic doors, all dead. In some ways, this was an advantage. Doors that had been electronically locked were now potentially passable, but it also meant that doors that had been keeping the infected contained might now be vulnerable. I knew the electrical systems of Rayford better than anyone still alive inside its walls. This wasn't just a power outage. It was a fundamental shift in the prison's architecture. Areas that had been inaccessible might now be open. Areas that had been safe might now be compromised. My first priority was light. I had my flashlight, but its batteries wouldn't last forever. In the storage closet, I found oil-burning emergency lamps kept for power failures. Using a lighter from the kitchen staff's break area, I lit one, keeping the flame low. The soft glow was enough to work by without attracting attention from outside. Next came security. With electronic locks disabled, I needed mechanical means to secure my position. I barricaded doors with shelving units, used kitchen knives as improvised door stops, ran inventory wire through door handles to create makeshift locks. Once my immediate area was secure, I assessed the implications of the power failure. My original escape plan had relied on accessing certain areas that were typically electronically locked. Those doors would now be on mechanical backup systems, potentially unlocked, but also potentially locked permanently without the right keys. The master keys I'd found in the locker room became even more valuable. I checked them against the warden's facility maps I'd brought back. They would open most mechanical locks in the administrative and service areas, enough to create a path to the northwest corner maintenance shed I'd identified as my exit point. But without camera feeds, I was moving blind. I had no way to know which areas were clear and which were infested. I would need to physically scout my route before attempting to move through it with supplies. The kitchen had a gas stove that didn't require electricity. I heated water, made coffee from the staff supplies, forced myself to eat. Physical strength would be essential for what came next. As I ate, I planned my scouting route. The maintenance tunnels remained the safest option for most of the journey, but I would need to surface at key points to check conditions. Halfway through my meal, I heard something that made me freeze mid-bite. Voices, coming from the corridor outside the kitchen. The inmates I'd seen in the administrative section had expanded their search area. They were close. I extinguished my lamp immediately, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Moved silently to the door, listening. They were discussing their findings, what areas remained to be searched. One voice, likely Jackson based on the distinctive rasp, mentioned the kitchen specifically. Gotta be food there if nowhere else. They were coming. Not immediately, but soon. The darkness worked in my favor for now. They would need light to search effectively, making them visible long before they saw me. But I couldn't stay. My timetable had just accelerated dramatically. I packed quickly. Only essentials: water, non-perishable food, weapons, tools for the escape, the handgun with full magazine, the makeshift spear, a kitchen knife secured to my belt, the master keys, warden's maps, emergency radio. Everything fit into a single backpack that wouldn't restrict movement in the tunnels. The maintenance access point in the kitchen storage area remained my best exit. I descended into the tunnels silently, securing the hatch above me. Just in time. As I started moving through the dark passage, I heard the kitchen door above me open, voices becoming clearer. They had arrived. The tunnels felt different without power. Darker, certainly, but also quieter. The background hum of electricity that had been a constant companion was gone. I moved by touch and memory, conserving my flashlight battery. My destination was a junction point beneath the laundry facility, which would give me access to the western portion of the prison, closer to my planned escape route. The journey took longer in complete darkness. Twice, I had to stop, confused about my location, and risk a brief flash of light to check junction markings. The second time, I heard something that didn't belong, movement in the tunnel ahead. Not the ordered footsteps of humans, but the irregular shuffling of the infected. I hadn't encountered infected in the tunnels before. They were too narrow, too confusing for their limited intelligence to navigate. But with power out and doors potentially open, they might have found their way in by accident, trapped like rats in a maze. I had two options: retreat and find another route, or deal with the threat. Retreating meant potentially running into the inmates searching the kitchen. Forward was my only real choice. I prepared my spear, steadied my breathing, and advanced slowly. The shuffling sound grew louder, one infected by the sound of it, moving aimlessly in the darkness. I clicked my flashlight on, aiming it forward. The beam caught the infected square in the face, a maintenance worker I didn't recognize, his uniform torn and bloody. The light confused him momentarily, giving me the seconds I needed. I lunged with the spear, driving it through his eye socket. He dropped without a sound. I stepped over the body and continued forward, conserving the flashlight again. The laundry access point was just ahead. I climbed the ladder, listened at the hatch for any sounds above, then pushed it open carefully. The laundry facility was massive. Industrial washers and dryers lined up in rows, now silent without power. The space was dim, lit only by sunlight coming through windows high in the walls. I scanned for movement, saw nothing immediate, and pulled myself up into the room. As my eyes adjusted to the relative brightness, I realized the laundry wasn't empty. Bodies lay scattered across the floor. Not infected, actual corpses. At least a dozen staff and inmates, all with gunshot wounds to the head. A massacre. But why? The answer came as I examined the scene more carefully. Bite marks. Every body showed evidence of bites at various stages of infection. Someone had executed the bitten before they could turn. A brutal but effective containment strategy. The implications sent a chill through me. If this had been standard procedure during the early hours of the outbreak, how many other areas of the prison contained similar scenes? And who had done the killing? There was no evidence the shooters themselves had become infected, which meant they had likely evacuated or established control somewhere in the facility. I checked the warden's map against my position, identifying the quickest route to the northwest maintenance shed. With the power out, I could access a service corridor that would take me directly there, bypassing most populated areas of the prison. It seemed almost too easy. I moved to the laundry exit, tested the door. Unlocked, as I'd hoped. I opened it a crack, peered into the corridor beyond. Clear in both directions. I slipped through, closing the door quietly behind me. The service corridor was narrower than the main hallways, designed for staff movement and supply transport. It ran along the western perimeter of the prison, connecting support facilities. Windows along the outer wall let in gray daylight. The storm that had been threatening for days had finally arrived, rain lashing against the glass. I moved quickly but cautiously, checking around corners before proceeding. Halfway to my destination, I encountered a barricade. Someone had piled furniture and equipment to block the corridor. Recently, judging by the lack of dust. I squeezed through a narrow gap, wondering who had created it and why. The answer came moments later. Beyond the barricade, the corridor floor was slick with fresh blood. A trail led to a storage closet, its door ajar. I approached carefully, weapon ready. Inside, I found the source. A guard, throat torn open, the wound still seeping, recently killed. His hand still clutched his service weapon, unfired. I took the gun, checked the magazine. Full, except for one round. The guard had been surprised, unable to defend himself. But against what? The infected I'd encountered moved slowly, noisily. How had one taken down an armed guard without him getting a shot off? The answer was somewhere ahead of me, between my position and freedom. Something faster, more dangerous than the standard infected. I moved with heightened caution now, all senses straining for any warning sign. The corridor turned right, then left, approaching the exterior wall where the maintenance shed stood. I was close. Through a window, I could see the shed's roof just 30 yards away. Freedom was tantalizingly near. Around the final corner, I found what had killed the guard. The corridor ahead was filled with infected, but not the shuffling, mindless kind I'd encountered before. These moved differently, faster, more coordinated. They were gathered around a fresh kill, another guard by the uniform, feeding. I pulled back immediately, processing what I'd seen. These infected were different. More recently turned, perhaps, with more physical capabilities intact. Or maybe the infection itself had variations, affecting different people in different ways. Either way, they were between me and escape. There was no way past them in the corridor. I needed an alternative route. The warden's map showed a parallel corridor 1 floor above. If I could access it, I might bypass this group entirely. A stairwell access door stood 10 yards back along the corridor. I retreated silently, tested the door. Locked. The master keys solved that problem. Inside, I ascended quickly to the 2nd floor, emerging into another service corridor. This one was clear, the silence complete except for the distant moans from elsewhere in the facility. Moving parallel to my original route, I approached the northwest corner from above. A window showed the maintenance shed roof directly below, exactly as the blueprints had indicated. 8 feet from the wall top, just as I'd calculated. Doable. But the window was designed not to open, a security feature to prevent exactly what I was planning. I would need to break it, which meant noise. Noise meant attention from both infected and possibly other survivors. I needed a diversion. The emergency radio in my pack gave me an idea. I tuned it to maximum volume, set it to scan frequencies, which produced a steady stream of static and occasional voiced fragments, placed it at the far end of the corridor behind a partially closed door where the sound would be muffled but audible. When I triggered it, I would have minutes at most before every infected in earshot converged on the sound. Enough time to break the window, drop to the shed roof, and climb over the wall, if I moved fast enough. I prepared methodically, wrapped my hand in a torn piece of clothing to break the glass, positioned my backpack securely, checked the drop to ensure nothing below would impale me, studied the wall top for the best climbing point once I reached the shed roof. Everything was set. I took a deep breath, moved to the radio, and pressed the power button. The static blared, startlingly loud in the silence. I ran back to the window, raised my protected fist, and struck the glass as hard as I could. The glass cracked, but didn't shatter. Prison windows, even interior ones, were reinforced. I struck again, harder, feeling the impact jar up my arm. The crack expanded, spiderwebbing across the surface. One more blow and it finally gave way, falling in chunks to the shed roof below. The radio's static continued to blare down the corridor. Already I could hear responses, the fast shuffling of the infected responding to the noise. I didn't have much time. I cleared the remaining glass from the window frame with my protected hand, then positioned myself to drop. The shed roof was about 12 feet below, enough to hurt if I landed wrong, but not likely fatal. I slipped through the opening feet first, hung from the windowsill to reduce the drop, then let go. I hit the metal roof hard, feeling the impact shoot through my legs. The roof creaked, dented slightly beneath my weight, but held. I'd made it to the first stage of my escape. The shed roof put me about 8 feet below the top of the prison's perimeter wall. Still a challenging climb, but possible. The wall's surface was rough concrete, offering minimal handholds. From my position, I could see the razor wire along the top, glinting dully in the gray daylight. I slung my backpack around to my front to keep my hands free, then started climbing. The concrete scraped my fingers raw as I searched for purchase. Twice I slipped, barely catching myself before falling back to the shed roof. Behind me, I could hear the infected converging on the radio inside. If they figured out how to get to the window, I'd be trapped. With a final push, I reached the top of the wall, careful to avoid the razor wire arranged in coils along the edge. The wire was designed to prevent inmates from climbing out, but there was a narrow maintenance path used by guards that offered a wire-free route. I balanced precariously on this 18-inch strip, looking down at the outside world for the first time in days. The drop to the outside was about 20 feet onto grassy but uneven ground. Too far to jump without risk of serious injury. I needed another way down. My pack contained 50 feet of electrical cable I'd salvaged from the maintenance room, standard copper wire with rubber insulation. Not ideal for climbing, but it would have to do. I secured one end to a sturdy pipe running along the wall top, tested it with my weight, then began to lower myself down the outside face. The descent was controlled but painful, the cable digging into my palms. When I reached the end of my improvised rope, I was still about 6 feet from the ground. I let go, dropped, and rolled to distribute the impact. Pain shot through my ankle as I stood, but it held my weight. I was out. I was outside Rayford's walls, but far from safe. The prison stood in relative isolation, surrounded by access roads and then open fields. About a mile to the east, a small service road connected to the main highway. That was my immediate destination. Reach the road, find transportation, get as far from here as possible. I pulled myself up, tested my ankle again, and started moving. The rain had tapered to a light drizzle, reducing visibility, but also potentially masking my presence from infected. I kept close to the perimeter wall as long as possible, using it for cover and guidance. At the eastern corner of the prison, I got my first clear view of the main access road. It was packed with abandoned vehicles, cars left by fleeing staff or family members coming to collect loved ones when the outbreak began. More concerning were the figures moving between the vehicles. Dozens of infected, some in civilian clothes, others in guard uniforms. My original plan had been to follow the access road to the highway. That was no longer viable. Instead, I would need to cut across the open fields to the east, a longer route, but potentially safer. I moved along the tree line bordering the prison grounds, staying low and watching for movement. The pain in my ankle was becoming more insistent with each step, but I couldn't stop. Distance from Rayford was my only priority now. Halfway across the first field, I heard an engine, an actual functioning vehicle, approaching from the direction of the highway. I dropped flat in the tall grass, watching. A military Humvee came into view, moving slowly along the access road toward the prison. 2 more followed behind it. Through my rain-streaked vision, I could make out armed personnel in biohazard gear scanning the area as they advanced. The military had finally arrived at Rayford. Not for rescue, judging by their tactical approach and heavy weaponry. This looked like a containment operation. The emergency broadcast had mentioned Protocol Wildfire, authorization to use lethal force. I stayed hidden as they passed, suspecting that in their eyes, anyone coming from the prison was a potential threat. Once the vehicles had passed, I continued east across the fields. My pace was slower now, the ankle definitely sprained, if not worse. I needed to find shelter, assess the injury, rest before continuing. About a half-mile ahead stood a small equipment shed used by the prison's agricultural program. It would have to do. The shed was unlocked, empty, except for farming tools and bags of fertilizer. I secured the door behind me, finally allowing myself to breathe. 4 days inside Rayford's walls. 4 days of constant vigilance and fear. I was out, but the nightmare was far from over. I examined my ankle in the dim light filtering through the shed's dirty windows. Swollen, bruised, but not broken. I wrapped it tightly with strips torn from my spare shirt, a makeshift compression bandage. It would have to be enough. While resting, I tuned the emergency radio to listen for updates. The broadcast had changed from the evacuation message I'd heard earlier. Now it was more direct, more concerning. This is Emergency Broadcast System Alpha. Military quarantine in effect for the following areas: Rayford County, Eastern Warren Township, Northern Detroit Metro. All civilians encountered will be subject to mandatory screening. Resistance will be met with appropriate force. Remain in your homes until cleared by military personnel. The quarantine zone was expanding. Whatever had started in Rayford was spreading despite containment efforts. The military's response was becoming more aggressive. I needed to get beyond the quarantine boundary before it expanded further. Through a gap in the shed boards, I could see the Humvees had reached the prison's main gate. Soldiers were deploying in tactical formation, preparing to enter the facility. Whatever they found inside wouldn't change their approach. Rayford would be sanitized, one way or another. Night was approaching. Moving in darkness would be dangerous but would provide cover from both infected and military patrols. I decided to rest until dusk, then continue east toward what the map showed as a rural residential area. Houses meant potential supplies, transportation, maybe even other survivors. As the light faded, I inventoried my supplies. Water for 2 days if I rationed carefully. Food for about the same. The handgun with a full magazine plus the guard's service weapon. Tools that could serve as weapons in a pinch. Not enough for long-term survival, but enough to get me to the next safe point. The rain intensified as darkness fell, providing additional cover for movement. I left the shed, orienting myself using the prison silhouette against the western sky. The military vehicles were still at the main gate, powerful spotlights now illuminating the entrance as teams moved inside. I headed east across the remaining fields, the wet grass soaking my pants to the knee. My ankle protested with each step, but the wrapping helped. After about 30 minutes of steady movement, I reached a barbed wire fence marking the boundary of prison property. Beyond it lay a narrow country road, and beyond that, the first scattered houses of a rural community. Getting over the fence with my injured ankle was a challenge. I used wire cutters from my toolkit to create an opening, carefully pulling the barbed strands apart. As I slipped through, my pack caught on a barb, tearing open one side. I managed to secure most of the contents, but lost some water and one of the energy bars to the mud below. The road was empty, eerily quiet compared to the constant background moans inside Rayford. No cars, no people, no signs of life except distant lights in some of the houses ahead. I moved along the shoulder, ready to dive into the ditch if headlights appeared. The first house I reached was dark, its driveway empty. I approached cautiously, circling to check all sides before trying the door. Locked, as expected. I moved to a window, peered inside. The home appeared untouched by the chaos. simply abandoned. Perhaps the owners had evacuated when news of the outbreak at Rayford spread. I broke a small pane in the back door, reached through to unlock it, and slipped inside. The house felt frozen in time. Dishes in the sink, mail on the counter, family photos on the walls. Whatever had driven the residents to leave, they had done so in a hurry. I searched methodically, finding useful supplies. Canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit with actual painkillers and proper bandages for my ankle. Most valuable of all, car keys hanging on a hook by the door. The garage was empty, the associated vehicle gone, but the keys might fit another car nearby. As I rewrapped my ankle with proper bandages, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of actually surviving this. I had made it out of Rayford. I had shelter, supplies, and a potential means of transportation. The quarantine zone was large, but not limitless. If I could get beyond its boundaries, I might find areas where society still functioned, where the military was containing rather than just eliminating threats. My planning was interrupted by the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. I moved to the window, staying back in the shadows. A military helicopter passed low overhead, searchlight sweeping the area below. They were expanding their search beyond the prison perimeter, looking for escapees, looking for me. I retreated from the window, waited until the sound faded. My window of opportunity was shrinking. By morning, this area would likely be crawling with military patrols. I needed to move further, find transportation, get beyond their search radius. The emergency radio crackled with updated broadcasts. The quarantine zone had expanded again, now encompassing a 30-mile radius around Rayford. Military checkpoints were established on all major highways leading out of the zone. Anyone approaching these checkpoints would be subject to enhanced screening protocols. I didn't like the sound of that. The broadcast also mentioned that several contaminated individuals had been neutralized, attempting to flee the quarantine zone. The military wasn't taking chances with potential carriers. The house had a map of the county in a drawer, likely used by the owners for hiking local trails. I studied it, identifying smaller roads and paths that might bypass military checkpoints. There was a network of farm access roads to the northeast that connected to county roads outside the quarantine boundaries. If I could find transportation, that would be my route. As dawn approached on my 5th day of survival, I prepared to move again. The helicopter had made several more passes during the night, its search pattern expanding outward from the prison. I had maybe an hour before daylight made movement more dangerous. I packed everything useful from the house: food, water, medical supplies, a heavier jacket against the rain, a proper flashlight with fresh batteries. The gun was secure at my waist, loaded and ready. I was as prepared as I could be for whatever came next. Before leaving, I found a piece of paper and a pen. Wrote a simple note to the homeowners, apologizing for the break-in and explaining I had taken only what was needed to survive. Signed it with my name. In this new world, that small act of humanity felt important, a reminder that civilization wasn't completely gone. I stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, ready for the next phase of my journey. Rayford was behind me, but its shadow still loomed large. I was free of its walls, but not its influence. Not yet. I moved from house to house in the pre-dawn darkness, searching for transportation. The rural community was small, maybe 20 homes scattered along the main road. Most showed signs of hasty evacuation. Doors left unlocked, personal items abandoned mid-use. No bodies, though. No infected. Whatever had happened here, the residents had gotten out before the worst arrived. The 5th house I checked had what I needed: a pickup truck in the driveway, older model Ford with a full tank according to the gauge. The keys weren't in it, but hot wiring a vehicle was among the many skills I'd picked up working alongside former car thieves in the prison maintenance crew. Ironic that their criminal knowledge would now save my life. I worked quickly, connecting the right wires under the steering column. The engine caught on the third try, rumbling to life. I kept the lights off, not wanting to attract attention from infected or military patrols. Using the county map I'd found, I plotted a route northeast along farm roads, avoiding main highways where checkpoints would be established. As I pulled away from the house, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a figure emerging from between houses, then another. Their movement was wrong, the distinctive shamble of the infected. They must have followed me from the prison, drawn by noise or scent or whatever senses guided them. I accelerated, leaving them behind. They weren't an immediate threat, but their presence confirmed my suspicions. The infection was spreading beyond Rayford's walls. The rural roads were mostly clear, occasional abandoned vehicles easily navigated around. I drove carefully, keeping speed moderate to reduce engine noise. As the eastern sky lightened with approaching dawn, I got my first good look at the surrounding countryside. Fields lay untended. Farm buildings stood silent. No people visible anywhere. About 10 miles from the prison, I encountered my first military checkpoint, a roadblock on a country intersection I hadn't expected them to cover. 2 Humvees positioned across the road, soldiers with rifles scanning approaching vehicles. I spotted them in time to kill my engine and coast into a farm access road out of their line of sight. This complicated things. The military was covering even minor roads, casting a wider net than I'd anticipated. I abandoned the truck, continuing on foot through a cornfield parallel to the road. Moving through the tall plants provided cover but slowed my progress considerably. My ankle throbbed with each step, the bandage now soaked with sweat and morning dew. I needed to reassess my route. The map showed a small river about 2 miles ahead that intersected with the quarantine boundary. Rivers rarely had permanent military presence along their entire length, too difficult to patrol effectively. If I could cross at an unguarded point, I might slip through the perimeter. The sun was fully up now, making concealed movement more difficult. I stayed in the cornfield as long as possible, then had to cross an open pasture to reach the river. I moved quickly despite my ankle, keeping low, using scattered trees for momentary cover. No signs of patrols, but the distant sound of helicopter rotors remained a constant reminder of the military presence. The river came into view, not particularly wide, maybe 30 feet across, but swift-moving from recent rains. I scanned both banks for any sign of patrols or monitoring equipment. Nothing visible. This section was remote enough to have escaped immediate attention. I didn't relish the idea of swimming in the cold water, but there was no visible bridge nearby. I secured my backpack as waterproof as possible using plastic bags scavenged from the houses, then waded in. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at my legs as the water deepened. By midstream, I was swimming, one arm stroking while the other held my pack above water. The far bank was muddy, difficult to climb with my injured ankle. I dragged myself out, soaked and shivering in the morning air. But I had crossed. According to the map, I was now beyond the eastern edge of the established quarantine zone. Not safe, but safer. I needed to dry off and warm up before hypothermia became a concern. About a quarter mile from the river stood a small hunting cabin, barely visible through the trees. It looked unoccupied. No vehicles, no smoke from the chimney. It would have to do. The cabin door was secured with a simple padlock, easily defeated with tools from my pack. Inside was basic but sufficient: a wood stove, canned goods in a small pantry, even a few changes of clothes left by the owner. I stripped off my wet prison maintenance uniform, dried myself with a musty towel, and dressed in borrowed flannel and jeans. They were too large but far less conspicuous than the uniform. I got a small fire going in the stove, careful to keep smoke minimal. As I warmed up, I checked the emergency radio for updates. The broadcasts confirmed what I'd suspected. The quarantine zone was expanding as the infection spread. The military was struggling to maintain the perimeter with reports of breaches requiring extreme containment measures. Translation: the infected were getting out, and the military was responding with lethal force against anything that moved. More concerning were reports of resistant infection vectors, infected individuals showing advanced mobility and problem-solving capabilities. This matched what I'd seen in the prison. Some infected were different, faster, more dangerous. The military was prioritizing these for elimination, considering them the highest threat. The cabin had a small battery-powered television. On the off-chance broadcasts were still happening, I turned it on. To my surprise, it picked up a signal, an emergency broadcast channel showing footage of military operations and evacuation centers. The images were heavily sanitized, showing orderly evacuation and confident military control. But the scrolling text at the bottom told a different story. Quarantine zones established in 17 states. Estimated casualties in excess of 100,000. Martial law declared nationwide. This wasn't just a local outbreak anymore. It was everywhere. I allowed myself 2 hours in the cabin. Time to rest, dry completely, and plan my next move. The map showed a small town about 5 miles northeast. Towns meant risks, more potential infected, but also resources. Food, medicine, transportation, maybe even information about safe zones beyond military control. Before leaving, I searched the cabin thoroughly for anything useful. The owner had been a hunter, judging by the mounted trophies and gun rack. The rack was empty. Either the owner had taken the weapons or someone else had already scavenged them. But behind a loose board in the closet, I found what the previous visitors had missed: a shotgun with 2 boxes of shells, likely the owner's backup weapon. I checked it carefully. A 12-gauge pump action, well maintained. Much more effective than the handgun for close encounters. I loaded it, secured the extra shells in my pack, and prepared to move out. The walk to town was tense, but uneventful. I stayed off roads, moving through woods and fields, stopping frequently to listen for vehicles or aircraft. My ankle was improving with proper bandaging and medication, though still tender. By midday, I reached the outskirts of the town, Mason's Mill, according to a weather-beaten sign. From a hillside overlooking the main street, I studied the situation before approaching. The town was small, maybe 1,000 residents pre-outbreak. Now it appeared largely abandoned. A few cars moved on the main street. Civilian vehicles, not military. Actual functioning society, or at least its remnants. Smoke rose from chimneys in some buildings. People had stayed or returned after evacuating. Most interesting was what I didn't see. No obvious infected wandering the streets, no military presence. This town had somehow avoided both the outbreak and military containment, at least for now. It might offer temporary sanctuary while I gathered supplies and information for the longer journey ahead. I approached cautiously, using side streets and keeping buildings between myself and the main road. The first few houses I passed were empty, windows dark. Then I heard voices, actual human conversation coming from a building ahead. A small grocery store, its windows covered with plywood, but its door propped open. I hesitated at the corner, assessing the risk. Human contact meant potential help, but also potential danger. In the New World, strangers were unknowns, and unknowns were threats until proven otherwise. But isolation wasn't a long-term survival strategy. Eventually, I would need allies. I secured the shotgun in my pack, not wanting to appear hostile, but kept the handgun accessible at my waist. Then I approached the store slowly, hands visible, calling out before reaching the door. "Hello inside. Just one person here looking for supplies and information." The voices inside went silent. After a moment, a man appeared in the doorway, middle-aged, wearing flannel similar to mine. He held a rifle, not pointed at me but ready to be raised if needed. Behind him, I could see others in the dimly lit store, similarly armed. "Where'd you come from?" the man asked, eyes narrowing as he studied me. I'd prepared for this question, knowing that Rayford Prison would likely get me shot on sight. "Farmhouse about 10 miles west," I said. "Been hiding there since things went bad. Figured I needed to find other people eventually." He studied me a moment longer, then nodded slightly. "We're not looking for trouble. We trade fair for supplies. You got anything worth trading?" I showed him some of the tools from my pack, electrical equipment that would be valuable in a world without power infrastructure. His expression changed, interest replacing suspicion. "You know how to use those? How to fix things?" "I was an electrician," I said. "Industrial systems, power distribution, generators. If it involves electricity, I can probably fix it or make it work better." The man lowered his rifle completely. "Well then, maybe we can help each other out. We've got a generator that's been giving us trouble. You get it running properly. We can talk about supplies and maybe share some information about what's happening out there." I nodded, feeling the first glimmer of hope since escaping Rayford. My skills had value in this new world. My knowledge could be traded for what I needed to survive. I followed him into the store, where a small community of survivors had created their own sanctuary against the chaos outside. I was still in danger, still hunted by both the infected and the military, still thousands of miles from any concept of safety. But for the first time since the alarms had sounded in the prison basement, I wasn't completely alone. And in a world where the dead walked and the living killed without hesitation, that counted for something. The group in Mason's Mill called themselves the Holdouts, about 20 people who had either refused evacuation or returned after military forces moved on. They'd established a functioning micro-community around the town center, with the grocery store serving as their main base of operations. Their leader was Dan Forrester, the man who'd first met me at the door. Former town council member who'd stepped up when everything fell apart. He explained their situation as I worked on their generator, a decent 10-kilowatt diesel model that had been improperly wired to the store's electrical system. "Military came through 4 days ago," he said, holding a flashlight as I reconnected the output terminals. "Told everyone to evacuate to the processing center in Warren. Some went. Those of us with sense stayed put. We've seen what happens at those processing centers from folks who escaped. Anyone showing even slight symptoms gets taken to quarantine. Never seen again." I nodded, focusing on the wiring but absorbing the information. This matched what I'd feared about the military's approach. Containment at any cost, including innocent lives. "What about the infected?" I asked, carefully stripping back insulation on a frayed wire. "None in town?" Dan's expression darkened. "Had some, early on. Dealt with them. Town this size, everyone knows everyone. Makes it harder when you have to put down Mrs. Wilson who taught 3rd grade for 30 years. But we did what needed doing. Now we have patrols, barricades on the main roads. So far, it's working." I finished the generator repairs, tested the output, and confirmed it was now running at full capacity while using less fuel. My value established, Dan invited me to join them for a meal and discussion of current conditions. The store's back room had been converted to living quarters, with camp stoves for cooking and tables arranged in a common eating area. Over a simple but filling meal of canned stew and crackers, I learned more about the wider situation. The holdouts had a ham radio operator, former military guy named Rodriguez, who maintained contact with other survivor groups across 3 states. The picture he painted was grim, but not hopeless. Major cities were lost causes. Infection density too high for effective containment. Rural areas fared better, especially isolated communities that could control access points. The military was establishing safe zones in defendable locations, but conditions inside were reportedly harsh. Food rationing, strict curfews, summary execution for rule breakers or suspected infected. Most relevant to my situation, Rodriguez confirmed that the military was indeed hunting escapees from known outbreak sites like Rayford. They considered anyone from such facilities potentially infected to be captured or killed rather than risked. I was right to have hidden my origins. "Where you headed next?" Dan asked as the meal concluded. No pressure in his voice, just practical curiosity. I considered carefully before answering. North, maybe. Canada, if the borders aren't completely locked down. Less population density might mean fewer infected. Rodriguez shook his head. Borders are sealed tight. Canadians have their own outbreaks to deal with. They're shooting anything that approaches from the U.S. side. This complicated my plans. Without international escape as an option, I needed to find somewhere within U.S. borders that offered long-term sustainability. Somewhere the infected couldn't easily reach and the military wouldn't prioritize for control. "Mountains," said an older woman who'd been quiet until now. Linda, the town's former librarian. Appalachian communities are reporting fewer outbreaks. Isolated, defensible, existing structures, access to water and hunting. If I were running, that's where I'd go. The Appalachians were far, but not impossibly so with transportation. It gave me a direction, a goal beyond simple escape. The holdouts offered me shelter for the night, which I gratefully accepted. A real bed, even a simple cot, was luxury after days of hiding and running. As I settled in for the night, Dan approached with a proposition. "We need someone with your skills, electrical systems, security, problem solving. You've seen what's out there, survived it. We could use that experience. Consider staying." It was tempting. These people had created something rare in the New World, a functioning community with some measure of safety. But I also recognized the fragility of their situation. One major incursion of infected, one military sweep through the area, and it would all disappear. Nothing was permanent anymore. "Let me sleep on it," I said, not wanting to reject outright the first genuine human connection I'd found since escaping. Sleep came surprisingly easily, the exhaustion of constant vigilance finally catching up with me. I dreamed of Rayford, of endless corridors filled with shambling figures, of being trapped as the walls closed in. I woke suddenly in pre-dawn darkness, heart racing, instantly alert. Something was wrong. The store was too quiet. The night watchman, who should have been visible from my position, was absent. I reached for my pack and weapons, moving silently to the window overlooking the main street. Military vehicles, 3 Humvees and a transport truck, parked at intervals along the road. Soldiers in tactical gear moving from building to building. Not a chaotic search, but a methodical one. House by house, business by business, working their way toward the grocery store. I moved quickly, waking Dan first, then the others. Military sweep, moving this way. Minutes, not hours. To their credit, they responded with practiced efficiency. No panic, just rapid preparation. The holdouts had planned for this possibility. Hidden compartments in the store's cellar, accessible through a trapdoor beneath shelving units. False walls concealing supply caches. Escape routes mapped through adjacent buildings. "What are they looking for?" I asked as people moved supplies and weapons into hiding spots. Dan's expression was grim. Could be routine, could be something specific. Either way, we can't risk contact. Their processing is a death sentence for half the people they take. The reality hit me suddenly. If they were searching for someone specific, it might be me. An escapee from Rayford was a high-value target, potentially carrying the infection beyond containment lines. I had led them here, endangered these people who had shown me kindness. I need to draw them away, I said. Decision made instantly. If they're focused on a single target, I can lead them off while you all stay hidden. Dan started to protest, but Rodriguez cut him off. He's right. Tactical diversion improves survival odds for the majority. Simple mathematics. I gathered my pack, checked my weapons. I'll take the northeast exit, head for the woods. Make enough noise to be noticed, but not enough to be caught immediately. Should buy you hours of distraction. Linda pressed a folded map into my hand. Marked routes to 3 different Appalachian communities accepting refugees. People I've talked to on the radio. Tell them Linda from Mason's Mill sent you. Dan handed me a 2-way radio. Short range, but it'll work for a few miles. Let us know when you're clear. These people had known me less than a day, yet were risking their own safety to help me escape. Humanity survived in pockets, even as the world collapsed around it. I moved through the store's back exit, into the alley behind. The pre-dawn light was just enough to navigate by. I could hear the military teams communicating as they searched, disciplined and thorough. 2 buildings away now. Time was short. I reached the edge of town, the forest line visible about 200 yards across an open field. Risky crossing, but my best option. I waited until the nearest patrol turned a corner, then ran. Halfway across the field, a shout went up. I'd been spotted. I didn't look back, just ran faster, my ankle protesting with each stride. Gunfire erupted behind me, but at this range with poor light, they were firing more for intimidation than accuracy. I reached the tree line, plunging into the underbrush as bullets splintered bark around me. Once in the forest, I had the advantage. Harder to track, multiple possible routes, cover from both visual spotting and gunfire. I moved quickly but carefully, setting a course northeast using the compass on my watch band. Behind me, I could hear vehicles starting up, orders being shouted. They would pursue, but the forest terrain would slow them, force them to spread out. Exactly what I needed, to scatter their forces, draw them away from Mason's Mill. After about a mile, I clicked the radio once, the signal we had arranged to indicate I was clear. 2 clicks came back. The holdouts were secure, undiscovered. My diversion had worked. I continued moving northeast, following game trails when possible to maintain speed while minimizing tracks. The Appalachians were hundreds of miles away, an impossible journey on foot. I would need transportation, supplies, luck. But I had direction now, purpose beyond mere survival. As the sun rose fully, I paused on a ridgeline looking back toward Mason's Mill. Smoke rose from one section of town, the military burning something or perhaps an accidental fire during their search. I hoped the holdouts remained safe in their hiding places. Good people trying to maintain humanity in an increasingly inhuman world. The radio crackled, Rodriguez's voice coming through with military precision. Package secure. Hunters moving southeast tracking false trail. Path northeast clear for now. Good luck, Electrician. They had survived, and they had bought me time and direction. I tucked the radio away and continued moving, the mental map of my journey extending beyond mere escape now. The mountains called, offering what might be my best chance at finding not just survival, but a life worth living in this broken world. Behind me, Rayford Prison felt increasingly distant, a nightmare fading with each mile. But its lessons remained sharp and clear. Move silently, trust cautiously, adapt constantly. The rules of the new world, written in blood and reinforced by survival. Hour 85 since the alarms first sounded in that basement electrical room. I was still alive, still moving, still human. In a world of walking dead and militarized extinction, that counted as victory. For now. I walked for hours through dense forest, keeping the morning sun to my right to maintain my northeastern heading. The military pursuit had faded, either abandoned or following false trails set by the Mason's Mill holdouts. Still, I kept moving, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the search teams. By midday, exhaustion and hunger forced me to pause. I found a small stream, replenished my water supply, and consumed one of the energy bars from my pack. Checking Linda's map, I identified my approximate position and the nearest potential shelter, an abandoned firewatch tower marked about 3 miles ahead. The tower would offer visibility, defensible position, and possibly communication equipment. Perfect for planning my next move. I continued on, the terrain growing steeper as I moved into hill country. My ankle held up better than expected, the proper wrapping and medication from Mason's Mill working effectively. Around mid-afternoon, I spotted the tower through a break in the trees. Rustic but solid, standing about 50 feet tall on a cleared hilltop. I approached cautiously, circling the base to check for signs of occupation, human or infected. Nothing recent. The area appeared untouched since the outbreak. The tower's ladder was metal, securely fastened despite years of weather exposure. I climbed carefully, testing each rung before putting my full weight on it. The observation cabin at the top was small but sufficient, maybe 10 feet square, with windows on all sides providing 360-degree visibility. A cot bolted to one wall, a desk with maps and logbooks, a battery-powered radio, likely non-functional after sitting abandoned for so long. Most importantly, no one else was there. I had found sanctuary, if only temporary. From this elevation I could see for miles. No signs of military patrols, no columns of smoke from nearby towns. Just endless forest, punctuated by occasional clearings and the distant ribbon of a highway to the east. According to the map, that highway could take me northeast toward the Appalachians if I could safely reach and navigate it. I settled in, allowing myself to truly rest for the first time in days. The tower's height made it naturally defensible. Anything approaching would be visible long before it reached me, and the single-access ladder could be easily monitored. As sunset approached, I noticed something concerning to the west. Helicopter activity above where Mason's Mill would be. Multiple aircraft, moving in search patterns. The military had expanded their search rather than abandoning it. Perhaps they had found evidence of the holdouts after all. Or perhaps they were still looking for me. Either way, I couldn't return to help. The best I could do was continue moving, drawing attention away from the town if I was indeed their target. I used the last of the daylight to study the maps in the tower, both Linda's marked map and the forestry maps left by the tower's previous occupants. The forestry maps showed something interesting, an old logging road about a mile east that connected eventually to the highway. If it was still passable, it would speed my journey considerably. It was worth investigating in the morning. I spent an uncomfortable but secure night in the tower, sleeping fitfully on the narrow cot. Dreams of Rayford continued to haunt me, corridors filled with the infected, always pursuing, never tiring. In my dreams, I recognized their faces. Colleagues, inmates I'd known for years. Each of them turned into something inhuman, yet wearing the faces of people I'd known. Dawn brought clarity and purpose. From my elevated position, I could see no immediate threats. The helicopter activity to the west had ceased. Time to move. I gathered my supplies, took a final survey of the surrounding terrain, and descended the tower. The forest was quiet as I made my way east toward the logging road. Too quiet, actually. No bird song, no small animals moving through underbrush. This unnaturalness put me on high alert. Something had disrupted the natural order recently. I found the logging road where the map indicated a dirt track wide enough for vehicles but heavily overgrown from lack of use. Still traversable on foot, potentially even by vehicle, with enough clearance. I followed it eastward, moving more quickly on the level ground than through the dense forest. About 2 miles along the road, I discovered why the forest had been so quiet. A military checkpoint had been established where the logging road met a larger county road. 2 Humvees and a troop transport. Soldiers with dogs, methodically searching the area. They were expanding their perimeter, cutting off escape routes from the direction of Mason's Mill. I retreated into the forest before being spotted, circling wide around the checkpoint. This complicated my journey considerably. The direct route to the highway was now blocked. I would need to move further north before turning east again, adding miles and days to my journey. The detour took me through increasingly rough terrain. Steep hillsides, dense vegetation, occasional rock formations requiring careful navigation. By late afternoon, I reached a ridgeline that offered another vantage point. The highway was visible in the distance, but so were more military vehicles moving along it. Checkpoints had been established at major intersections. They were creating a complete cordon. I needed a new strategy. Continuing on foot would eventually lead to capture, or worse. I needed transportation to break through their perimeter before it fully closed. Looking at Linda's map again, I noticed a small marking she'd added about 5 miles north. TB Cabin, Ham Radio. A potential ally, or at least a source of information. Worth the risk to investigate. I set off immediately, wanting to cover as much ground as possible before darkness made navigation more difficult. The journey north was arduous, the terrain becoming increasingly mountainous. My body, already pushed to its limits by days of stress and exertion, began to protest. The ankle throbbed constantly now. Fatigue made every step an exercise in determination. As dusk approached, I spotted a thin column of smoke rising above the trees ahead. Someone had a fire going. I approached with extreme caution, moving from cover to cover, all senses alert for danger. The cabin was small but well-maintained, nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by pines. A generator hummed quietly behind it. More importantly, a ham radio antenna rose from the roof, exactly what Linda's map had indicated. Someone here was in communication with the outside world. I observed for nearly an hour before approaching. A single occupant moved around inside, visible occasionally through windows. Older man, bearded, moving with the confidence of someone comfortable in his environment. No signs of military presence, no indication of infection. Finally, I approached openly, stopping at the edge of the clearing where I would be visible. "Hello, the cabin," I called, keeping my hands visible and weapons holstered. "I'm looking for the ham radio operator. Linda from Mason's Mill suggested I might find help here." The door opened cautiously. The bearded man emerged, a hunting rifle held across his chest, not pointed at me, but ready. "Linda sent you? When did you see her?" "Yesterday morning," I answered truthfully. "Military came through searching. I left to draw them off, headed northeast based on her suggestion." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Name's Thomas Burke. Most call me Mountain Tom. Linda's good people. If she sent you, you can approach." Slowly. I walked forward deliberately, still keeping my hands visible. Everett Kovacs. I was an electrician before all this, looking to reach the Appalachians. Linda marked some communities on a map for me. Tom's posture relaxed slightly at the mention of my profession. "Electrician," Huh? Generator's been acting up. Might be a fair trade, repairs for information, and a meal. And just like that, I'd found another temporary haven. Tom's cabin was well stocked, well defended, and crucially connected to the outside world through his radio setup. He had been a doomsday prepper before the outbreak, his isolated lifestyle and stockpiled supplies leaving him well positioned for the apocalypse. Over a meal of venison stew, the first fresh meat I'd had since before the outbreak, Tom shared what he knew. The situation was deteriorating nationwide. Major cities were essentially lost, either to infection or the military's increasingly desperate containment measures. What he called the scorched earth protocols were being implemented in heavily infected areas, systematic destruction of all structures and elimination of all life, infected or not. "They're drawing lines in the sand," he explained, refilling my bowl, "sacrificing some areas to protect others. They call them write-off zones on the military channels. Your prison was in one of those zones. Anything that walks out of there, they shoot on sight." This explained the aggressive pursuit. I wasn't just an escapee. I was from a designated containment zone, automatically considered contaminated. "How far does the military perimeter extend?" I asked, spreading Linda's map on the table. Tom traced a rough circle with his finger, encompassing a 30-mile radius around Rayford. Roadblocks here, here, and here. Air patrols covering the gaps. River crossings monitored. But they're stretched thin, focusing on major transportation routes. The deep woods they mostly leave alone except for occasional sweeps. He pointed to a location about 20 miles northeast. "There's a place here, old mining community called Black River. Remote, hard to find unless you know where to look. They're taking in people if they bring skills. Strict screening process, but fair. No military presence. Self-sufficient as much as possible." Black River wasn't one of the communities Linda had marked, but it was closer, potentially reachable within a day or two of hard travel, a staging point for the longer journey to the Appalachians. "How do I find it?" I asked. Tom studied me carefully, making his final assessment. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he reached for a pencil and marked a precise location on my map. "Follow this creek upstream. When you reach a fork with 3 dead pines on the right bank, take the left fork. About 2 miles up, you'll see a rock formation shaped like a bear's head. The trail to Black River starts behind it." He offered me shelter for the night, which I gratefully accepted. Before sleeping, I repaired his generator as promised, fixing a voltage regulator issue that had been causing it to run inefficiently. Small payment for information that might save my life. As I prepared to leave at dawn, Tom handed me a small handheld radio. "Short range, but the Black River folks monitor this frequency. When you get close, call in with Mountain Tom vouches. It'll get you a hearing at least." Another unexpected kindness from a stranger. Perhaps the end of civilization had reminded some people of the value of human connection. Or perhaps good people had always existed, and it took catastrophe to reveal them. With new purpose and direction, I set out as the sun rose on my 6th day of freedom. Rayford was fading behind me, becoming part of my past rather than defining my present. Ahead lay uncertainty but also possibility. In a world of walking dead and military exterminators, that counted as hope. I followed the creek as Mountain Tom had instructed, moving with renewed purpose. The terrain was challenging, steep banks, slippery rocks, dense underbrush, but the flowing water provided both guidance and drinking supply. By midday, I reached the fork with the 3 dead pines standing sentinel on the right bank. Taking the left fork as directed, I continued upstream. The journey was physically demanding but mentally liberating. For the first time since the alarms had sounded in Rayford's basement, I was moving toward something rather than away from danger. Black River represented more than safety. It offered the possibility of community, of rebuilding some version of normal life. About 2 hours after taking the fork, I spotted the bear-shaped rock formation Tom had described. Massive and unmistakable, it loomed over the creek like a guardian. Behind it, barely visible unless you were looking for it, a narrow trail wound upward into the hills. I paused before taking the trail, gathering my strength and checking my supplies. The food from Tom's cabin would last another day if carefully rationed. Water was plentiful from the creek. My weapons were secured but accessible. The radio Tom had given me was tucked safely in an outer pocket of my pack. The trail climbed steeply, switchbacking up the hillside. Old mining country, the remnants of operations long abandoned visible occasionally through the trees, collapsed shafts, rusted equipment, stone foundations of buildings long gone. History being reclaimed by nature, a process now accelerated as humanity's footprint diminished. Near the summit, I stopped, sensing I was close to Black River. According to Tom, they monitored approaches to their community. If they were as organized as he suggested, they likely had lookouts watching this trail. I took out the radio, turned it on, and spoke clearly. "This is Everett Kovach approaching from the South Trail. Mountain Tom vouches. I'm alone and looking for shelter." Static for several seconds, then a woman's voice responded, "Proceed to the summit. Stop at the fallen oak. Wait to be met." I continued upward, the trail leveling out as it approached a ridgeline. The fallen oak was impossible to miss, a massive tree that had once dominated the summit, now lying across what had been the trail. I stopped as instructed and waited, making no attempt to conceal myself. 10 minutes passed before two figures emerged from the forest ahead. A man and woman, both armed with hunting rifles, moving with the practiced confidence of people comfortable in their environment. They stopped about 20 yards away, weapons not quite pointed at me but definitely ready. "That's far enough," the woman called. She was middle-aged, lean and weathered by outdoor living. "State your business and origin." I kept my hands visible, voice steady. "Everett Kovach. I was at Rayford Federal Prison when the outbreak hit. I was an electrician there, maintenance staff, not inmate. Escaped 4 days ago and have been moving northeast since. Mountain Tom suggested Black River might offer shelter in exchange for my skills." The man spoke for the first time, voice gruff. "Rayford's a hot zone. Military's hunting anyone from there." "I know," I acknowledged. "I've been avoiding their patrols. I've had no symptoms, no exposure to infected beyond observation distance." "I understand if that makes you cautious." The woman studied me intently. "Tom vouched, you said?" "He doesn't do that lightly." "I fixed his generator," I offered. "He said Black River might value someone with electrical knowledge." They exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. The woman nodded slightly. "We have protocols," she said. 3 days isolation before joining the community. Daily medical checks. You agree to that, we can offer temporary shelter and consider permanent arrangement based on behavior and needs. It was more than fair given the circumstances. I nodded agreement. "Follow us," the man said, turning back toward the forest. "Stay 5 yards back at all times. Touch nothing without permission." They led me along a barely visible path through dense forest for about a mile before Black River came into view. The community was larger than I'd expected, perhaps 30 structures ranging from traditional cabins to more improvised shelters built from salvaged materials. A small hydroelectric setup was visible on the creek running through the valley below. Gardens in various stages of cultivation. Smokehouse. Communal cooking area. Perhaps 100 people moving about with purpose. But security was evident everywhere. Lookout positions strategically placed, barriers and traps on approach routes. armed individuals patrolling the perimeter. This wasn't just a collection of survivors. It was an organized community with clear defenses. They brought me to a small cabin separated from the main settlement by about 100 yards. "Quarantine cabin," the woman explained. 3 days here. Food and water provided. Medical checks morning and evening. No leaving for any reason. Bathroom facilities inside. Any violation ends your stay immediately and permanently. The cabin was basic but clean. Bed, table, chair, shelves with books, a battery-powered lamp. Separate bathroom with running water. Impressive for their situation. Barred windows and a solid door that locked from the outside. Prison-like, but understandable under the circumstances. My guides introduced themselves as I settled in. The woman was Sarah, head of their security team. The man was Marcus, former park ranger who now served as Black River's chief scout. They took my weapons and pack, promising to return everything if I cleared quarantine. "Rest," Sarah advised before leaving. "Doctor will see you in an hour. Council will interview you tomorrow about skills and background." Alone in the cabin, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief at finding shelter, anxiety about the medical checks. Would they detect something I didn't know I carried? Hope that this place might offer more than temporary refuge. And underneath it all, persistent awareness that I remained a fugitive in multiple senses, hunted by the military, potentially harboring an infection that could destroy this community, carrying memories of Rayford that set me apart from these people. The doctor arrived punctually, an older woman named Chen with kind eyes and methodical hands. She checked vital signs, examined me for any wounds or bites, drew blood for testing, asked detailed questions about my exposure history and symptoms. "You're in excellent condition considering what you've been through," she said as she finished. "We'll know more from the blood work, but preliminary signs are good. Rest tonight. Proper nutrition and hydration will help your body fight off any potential infection." That night, alone in the quarantine cabin, I slept deeply for the first time since the outbreak. The sense of relative safety, despite the locked door and barred windows, allowed my exhausted body to finally surrender to complete rest. Morning brought the promised council interview. 3 community leaders joined Sarah in the cabin, maintaining careful distance as they questioned me about my background, skills, and journey from Rayford. I told them most of the truth: my work as an electrician, my escape through the maintenance tunnels, my observations about the infected and military response. I omitted some details that might raise concerns: the extreme violence I'd witnessed, the inmates I'd encountered after the outbreak, certain moral compromises made for survival. The council seemed particularly interested in my electrical expertise. Their hydroelectric system was functional, but inefficient. The solar panels they'd salvaged needed proper integration into their power storage system. Communications equipment required maintenance and potentially expansion. "If you clear quarantine," one council member said, "we could use someone with your skills. We operate on a contribution system here. Everyone works, everyone receives according to need and availability. No currency, no private ownership of critical resources. That arrangement acceptable to you?" I nodded agreement. After what I'd seen of Collapse, their communal approach seemed not just acceptable, but necessary. Individual survival was possible, but precarious. Collective effort offered stability and progress. The 3-day quarantine passed with surprising speed. Regular meals, medical checks, interviews about specific skills I could contribute. Through the cabin windows, I observed the community's daily rhythms: work rotations, security protocols, food preparation, children being taught in an outdoor classroom. A functional society emerging from chaos. On the morning of the 4th day, Dr. Chen arrived with Sarah. Both were smiling. "Blood work is clear," Chen announced. "Vital signs stable. No indications of infection. Quarantine complete. Sarah unlocked the door fully for the first time. Welcome to Black River, Everett. Let's find you permanent housing and get you oriented to our systems. The transition from quarantine to community member was seamless. I was assigned a small cabin shared with 2 others, a former construction worker named Miguel and a botanist called Ellie, who managed the community's seed bank. My electrical expertise was immediately put to use optimizing their power systems. Within weeks, I had rewired their entire distribution setup, increasing efficiency by nearly 40%, installed lightning protection for sensitive equipment, established a more reliable communication system using salvaged parts. My value to the community was established and recognized. But more importantly, I found something I hadn't expected to find again after Rayford: purpose and connection. These people were building something meaningful from the ruins of civilization, not just surviving, but creating a new way of living that might prove more sustainable than what came before. 2 months after arriving at Black River, I stood on the ridge overlooking the community, now bustling with expanded gardens, new structures, reinforced defenses. The military patrols had never found this place, hidden deep in territory they considered too remote to prioritize. The infected rarely wandered this far into the wilderness, and those that did were spotted and eliminated long before reaching the settlement. I thought back to that electrical room in Rayford's basement, to the moment the alarms had sounded and the world had begun to end. 4 days of terror and survival that had led improbably to this new beginning. The prison electrician who had escaped the apocalypse, finding not just survival, but renewal. As I watched the community below, Sarah joined me on the ridge. In the weeks since my arrival, we had developed a cautious friendship that was slowly evolving into something more. Scout team reported military pulling back from the region, she said. Focusing resources elsewhere. Might mean they've given up on finding Rayford escapees. I nodded, feeling a weight lifting that I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. Or they've accepted that anyone who survived this long isn't a threat. She studied me with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see more than I sometimes wanted to reveal. You know, you never really explained how you got out of that prison when so many others didn't. What made the difference for you? I looked out over Black River, considering her question. Knowledge, I finally said. I knew the systems, the hidden routes, how things worked beneath the surface. In a crisis, understanding infrastructure is the difference between trapped and free. Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper significance. That's why you're so valuable here. You see the systems that make survival possible. Perhaps that was my real contribution to this new world. Not just fixing generators or wiring solar arrays, but understanding how systems work, how they fail, and how they can be rebuilt better than before. The prison electrician who survived because he knew what others didn't, now helping build a community that might outlast the chaos. The 96th hour after the outbreak had marked my escape from Rayford. But here, now, I realized that escape had been just the beginning of a much longer journey. Not just away from death, but toward a new kind of life.